Welcome everybody. This is CEPR Political Economy webinar, one of the silver linings of the last and this difficult years when CEPR's Political Economy Group, Research and Policy Network on Conflict and Research and Policy Network on Populism came together to organize a joint monthly seminar online. So we meet every first Monday of a month at 3 p.m. London time. And we are very fortunate to have great speakers from around the world. Today we'll have Nancy Qian from Kellogg, who will talk about political economy of famine in Soviet Union. And just to mention that we already have a lineup until the summer, which means that in May we'll have Paolo Giuliana and in June we'll have Francesca Trebi, so don't miss that. So without further ado, Nancy, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for inviting me, us, to present this paper to you guys. It's a real honor, and it's actually, it's a great, this is a great opportunity for us to present to a European audience who is very knowledgeable in this subject. So your questions and comments are very welcome. Natasha and Andrei are both on chat, and I will pause periodically to see if there are any questions that are unanswered or that people would like to be raised in vocally. All right, so the paper is called The Political Economic Causes of the Soviet Great Famine, because that's what the paper is about. It's a very descriptive title. So let me just motivate why we're studying this a little bit, not too much because I don't think it's too much of that. I think it's obviously important. In the 20th century, more famine deaths occurred, more people perished from famine than from both world wars combined. Amartya Sen made this point very salient to the economics community starting in the 1980s. Now, amongst these famines, the second largest in total mortality occurred in the Soviet Union from 1932 to 1933. Approximately 7 million people died. The mortality was very unevenly distributed. It was higher in rural areas and for certain ethnic groups. In particular, out of the 7 million, 2.6 to almost 4 occurred in the Ukraine, which only had a population of 32 million at the time. 1 to 1.5 occurred in Kazakhstan, which only had a population of 6.9 million at the time. Now, before I go on, I'm just going to say this is the last meaningful thing I'm going to say about Kazakhstan, despite how much it suffered from the famine, simply because we have no data. And my co-authors and I are happy to discuss data, in chat or afterwards. So the Soviet government denied the occurrence of the famine until the 1980s. Now, since the 80s, there's been a lot of work done about what caused the famine, as well as how the famine manifested by historians and economic historians around the world. And here, let me just categorize the causes into two groups. One is a traditional explanation of aggregate food shortage. Now, this type of explanation started way back in the 18th century with Malthus. And the idea is that you just don't have enough food to feed all the people in your country. Now, why don't you have enough food? It is because there's bad weather, and there's bad weather combined with inadequate relief policies. So economic historians such as Davies and Wheatcroft have argued that inadequate relief policies and poor early Soviet policies, together with bad weather, contributed to production that was too little to feed the population of the Soviet Union, and in particular, the Ukraine. Now, there's a second category of explanations, which we can just call political economy explanations. This is why we're presenting this paper at the political economy workshop. And I would give credit to Sen as the father of this category of explanation. So Sen says, actually, there is no aggregate food shortage in any of these 20th century famines. In each case, the nation always produces more than enough food to keep its people alive. The problem is distributional inequality that's driven by political concerns. Specifically, the ruling group captures the food, and a lack of entitlement over food for the other groups results in starvation for those groups. So this theory was inspired by the Bengal famine of the 1940s, but it has been applied over the years to many different types of famines. Now, in the Soviet case, people have called the famine Holodomor, which means in Ukrainian to kill by starvation. And they have argued that it was an intentional war or terror by starvation in order to weaken the Ukrainian resistance to Soviet economic policy. Now, this argument has been made by a large number of historians, politicals, and political scientists. This topic is incredibly controversial, on both sides. So the Ukrainian parliament declared the famine to be a genocide in 2003. The European Parliament called it a crime against humanity. The lower house of the Russian parliament condemned the U.S.S.R's disregard for the lives of people in 2008. And political scientists have shown that there are political repercussions today as far as political attitudes in the Ukraine towards Russia. On the other hand, there are people who have argued that although the famine was a terrible tragedy and may owe some of the causes to state policy, everyone suffered. It wasn't targeted towards Ukrainians specifically. Now, I can go on and on about the things that people say and the controversy, but ultimately, where we're at today, when we started the study anyways, is an impasse. And the impasse is due to the fact that there's little systematic empirical evidence because of a lack of data. The existing evidence is typically descriptive and narrative, and so the argument goes on and on. The main challenge was that there was no representative subnational data that would allow us to simultaneously examine competing hypotheses. The Soviet archives opened to researchers in the 1990s, and historians and social scientists have been diligently piecing together the data, but this is a slow process. Now we, and I should say here, my co-authors, who are economic historians of the Soviet Union and Russia, we together as a team have really benefited from this long tradition, from the last 30 years of data compilation. So we have been able to take the data that scholars have put together and then add archival data that we collected on our own to construct a very large data set that will allow us to do the analysis that's necessary to disentangle the different arguments for what caused the Soviet famine. Okay, so the goal of this paper is to understand the causes of the Soviet famine with rigorous empirical evidence. Using all the data that is available to us, we construct the largest and most comprehensive data set of the famine era. Like I said, this includes archival data, published data, geospatial data, data that other scholars have put together, data that my co-authors have collected manually from the archives on their own. Our data will span the three largest republics of the Soviet Union: Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. We're going to be able to observe these three republics at the province level and at the district level, and we construct panels at each of these levels. And I'll talk about this more in detail when it becomes relevant. Now, why was it so important to construct these data? Well, the data allows us to control for confounding factors. So we're able to evaluate all of the things that have come up in the literature simultaneously and distinguish between competing hypotheses. The disaggregated enriched data set will also allow us to provide evidence for the mechanisms of the story that emerges from the data. Now, let me tell you the specific question that we are going to pose to the data. The questions we want to ask in our paper that we want to answer is: one, Was there an aggregate food shortage during the famine? 2, if not, was there unequal distribution of food across the population? 3, did ethnic Ukrainians die more than other ethnicities, all else equal? And as part of that, if they did, what we want to ask is, the story about how Ukrainians were dying from the famine because they were targeted because of this perception that they were going to resist collectivization. We want to provide evidence for that. Did Ukrainians resist agricultural collectivization more than others? Did Soviet policies increase famine mortality more for Ukrainians? We want to connect the Soviet policies to Ukrainian mortality if that's where the story takes us. Now let me preview the main results. So doing an aggregate food accounting exercise, we find that there was no aggregate food shortage. Per capita food production and rural food retention. This is the amount of food in the rural area after the government has taken food away to give to urban populations and to export. Per capita rural retention was more than 5 times what was needed to avoid famine mortality. This was true in the Soviet Union as a whole. This was true in each of the 3 republics we have separate data for, including the Ukraine. We find that there was a positive association between mortality and the Ukrainian population share, even after we control for a large number of factors, such as weather, demographic structure, geography, per capita agricultural production, and even pre-famine political characteristics, including the pre-famine level of collectivization. So Ukrainians did die more. Okay, and then when we dive into the mechanisms to see if there's anything to the story of this regime targeting Ukrainians in order to control them and suppress them because of the need to control agricultural collectivization, we document that indeed Ukrainians resisted collectivization more than other ethnic groups. Collectivization led to more resistance, but even more so for amongst ethnic Ukrainians. And then the final part of our study is we document that Soviet policies and loyalty to the regime increased famine mortality more for ethnic Ukrainians than for any other ethnic groups. And it was even worse if the local bureaucrat himself was not ethnic Ukrainian. All in all, if we do a back of the envelope calculation, we find that if there was no ethnic bias against Ukrainians during the famine, then we would have 76% fewer deaths for Ukrainians and 76%. Let me phrase this more accurately, actually. Ethnic bias against Ukrainians contributed to 76% of famine deaths in the 3 republics we observe in our data, and 92% of famine death in the Ukraine. Okay. So our study is related to a big literature about the causes of famine in economics. Now, these studies have not focused so much on the Soviet Union. We have studies about India, Ireland, China. We are also related to several recent studies about early Soviet economic policies. So these studies have also not focused on the famine because of data limitations. They mention it, they take it into account, but they haven't been able to really tackle it directly with the data. And then in terms of our results and how you interpret our results, we don't have a formal model in the paper, but our results are entirely consistent with the model of ethnic bias and mass killing from Esteban et al. And the more recent empirical paper by Heldry in the Review of Economic Studies. And the logic, the conceptual framework in these papers says that strategic mass killing and genocide are more likely to occur when there are more natural resources and labor productivity is low and state capacity is high. And the Soviet case and the Ukrainian case fits this perfectly. We're also related. One thing to keep in mind is that the Soviet Union was a pretty new nation at this point. It was 20, 30 years new. And ethnic homogenization in a nation has been shown to be a feature of early nation building by studies such as Alesina and Reich. And finally, I just wanted to say that our paper is related to these recent studies about the long-run effects of famine on Ukrainian and Russian economic and political outcomes today. Okay, I'm going to talk about the background. It's a very abbreviated version of history that one writes many books about. One can write many books about. Then I will present the aggregate food accounting analysis. And finally, I will talk about the subnational analysis. Specifically, I'll talk about inequality across ethnic groups and the causes of inequality across these groups before I conclude. So before I move on to the next section, are there any questions, Sergey, that I should address?
No, your co-authors are taking a good care of the chat, so please go ahead.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So this is this super fast Cliff Notes version of early Soviet history, and I'm going to try to focus on the eve of when the famine occurs. So for this timeline, you can read the timeline, but what's important for us is that mass collectivization for agricultural areas in the Soviet Union begins in 1929, right? And the first tidings of famine start to filter in 1931. In the fall, during the harvest of 1931, there was a 17% decline in production. Grain procurement targets, in contrast, increased by 20%. It was known that peasants were consuming seed stock in order to survive the winter and the spring. In 1932, additional harvest shortfalls occurred, and there was an increase in mortality during that winter, and it peaked in the spring of 1933. So when people define, what years of the famine, they usually think of 32 and 33 when peak mortality occurred. In 1934, national mortality rates returned to trend, although it was not a uniform end. Some places took longer than others to recover. Okay. Now, I think many of you in the audience know a lot about agricultural collectivization in the Soviet economy, but let me just talk a little bit about it. So bolstering grain production and controlling distribution was central to the Soviet government, because grain production was one of the key drivers of GDP, key components of Soviet GDP. Now, the Soviet government was ideologically committed to not having markets and to having the centrally planned procurement system where it told people what to produce, and then it procured the grain for urban areas and for export. And this was a very unpopular policy, as you can imagine. So in 1930, in order to show that there is broad support for collectivization, the government organized a forcible congress where every region sent party delegates to vote yes. And the more people they sent, the more loyalty they were demonstrating. And this is going to be relevant later when we examine mechanisms. In the meantime, collectivization was very unpopular. Peasants resisted. Those who resisted were labeled as kulaks, and they were quote unquote liquidated. In the extreme, some people were shot. Many were sent to Siberia into exile. Now, by 1931, approximately 60% of Soviet agriculture was collectivized. That rate was higher in the Ukraine. What does collectivization mean? In principle, it meant no private property, no private grain stocks. Farmers were no longer one of the immediate outcomes of the privatization of property was that livestock declined by almost a half in the entire regime. Peasants slaughtered and killed them and ate them. If they weren't allowed to, they stopped feeding them. I'm mentioning this because this is also important to keep in mind when we think of the total magnitude of famine. A traditional way for peasants to live through a bad harvest is to slaughter the livestock and eat it until the next season. And so the ability for the Soviet peasants to moderate the effects of a bad harvest this way was significantly curtailed by the decline in livestock before the famine. Okay, so food was produced in teams. The state procured food from rural areas, distributed to urban areas, stored it in national depots, and also exported it. Peasants were left with subsistent amounts. In principle, peasants needed to be left healthy and alive so that they can produce the next season. Okay, now let me talk a little bit about the Ukrainian dilemma. Ukrainians are the largest minority group within the Soviet Union. So the biggest ethnic group is comprised of Russians. Ukrainians are about half as large as the Russians. They are 5 times as large as the next group, right? And moreover, ethnic Ukrainians are very concentrated in agricultural areas. It's a very geographically concentrated and numerous population in the most productive areas of the Soviet Union. On top of that, relative to many other ethnic groups, they had a strong cultural identity. They had their own language. They were politically organized. They had their own communist party infrastructure. Now, the regime from the very beginning was aware of this dilemma. And what is the dilemma? That they were treading a very delicate balance. On the one hand, they really needed the cooperation of the Ukrainians if the Soviet Union was going to be successful, right? Because the Ukrainians controlled the grain producing land. So they were always balancing 2 types of policies, right? Two incentives. One was they could get cooperation with indigenization policies that supported the ethnic and nationalistic identities within the Soviet Union. And what this meant was, schools in their own language. Ukrainians had their schools in their own language. They had their own communist party that was mostly led by ethnic Ukrainians. Alternatively, the regime could try to get direct control by just suppressing these groups. And it was sort of a delicate balance. So from the very beginning, Lenin and then later Stalin, amongst many others, were always concerned that Ukrainians would resist collectivization, agricultural collectivization, and undermine Soviet economic success, political economic success. In the early years, the regime adopted indigenization policies. These indigenization policies were notably abandoned during the famine. In 1932, the Central Committee decree blames Ukrainian nationalism for resistance to collectivization and the famine. Ethnic Ukrainian party leaders from all levels resigned in protest to killing so many Ukrainians. In 1932, after reports of imminent famine, Stalin actually emphasizes controlling Ukraine, maintaining high grain procurement, and he replaced ethnic Ukrainian leaders with leaders who were not ethnically Ukrainian, who were loyal to him. Indigenization policies were officially overturned and ended in 1932. Okay. So if there are no questions, I'll move to food accounting.
No questions,
Okay.
Please go ahead.
So let me talk about food availability. So this accounting exercise is very straightforward. The main difficulties come from getting data and converting data into caloric needs. One of the advantages of researching a centrally planned economy is central planners have to figure out how much food is produced and how much people need to eat. So we can, to a large extent, just use the data and the metrics and tables that they created. So we have data for population, production, and procurement from official statistics. These are believed to be accurate, with the exception of aggregate production data, which may have been exaggerated. Davies and Wheatcroft painstakingly constructs an adjusted estimate of production that is lower than the official statistics, and we will use their production, aggregate production estimates as a lower bound of production. Then we're going to need to convert the amount of grain that is produced to calories that are consumed. This requires an assumption of the average food bundle, consumption bundle of the average person in the Soviet Union. Like I said, we are actually going to use official tables created by the government. Now, we're actually going to use then finally we have to decide on how many calories people need. There are two thresholds. The first is heavy labor. And again, for here, we rely on official Soviet estimates of how much adult males need for doing heavy labor. And I want to tell you, this is an interesting thing. Soviet central planners' estimates of the calories that people need are higher than any other estimates in the world. For example, the U.S. CDC makes estimates today. The WHO has estimates. Soviet estimates are the highest amongst any we've come across in terms of how much the central planners were planning to leave people or thought they should leave people. We also have a lower threshold for just staying alive. And for this one, we're going to use this 900 calories per day for prime age adult that was taken from the Andrei. This is also the number for staying alive. This is the upper bound for staying alive that you get from the Minnesota starvation experiment, which is an experiment that the US military ran on conscientious objectors during World War II. Okay, now all of these are for, the numbers I gave you are for adult males in the prime of their life. We obviously need to adjust this by the demographic composition because the elderly, the young, women need fewer calories. People in urban areas doing white-collar desk job need Soviet calories. And so we take demographic composition data and make all these adjustments. After we do this, let's just focus on 31 and 32. And so what are we doing? We have data on total population, rural population. We have data on reported production and on Davis and Wheatcroft's lower bound estimates of production. We know the total amount that was procured. So we have data on procurement data. We have procurement data that the government took away. And with these data, we are able to calculate per capita production in calories for the whole country on average. And when we do that, we find that per capita production is much higher than what the two thresholds, the one needed to being very healthy for heavy labor and the one needed to avoid mortality. Again, note that these numbers are lower than those benchmarks I showed you earlier, because now we are taking into account that a large chunk of the population actually needs fewer calories than prime age adult men. Okay, here's the interesting thing. Even if you use Davies and Wheatcroft's lower estimates, the Soviet Union is still producing more than what's needed for heavy labor or to avoid mortality. And then finally, what if we just look at rural retention, right? Because we know that most of the mortality happened in rural areas. So maybe the surplus in urban areas was so high that in rural areas they had aggregate rural shortage. That's not the case. Even after we take away the grain procured and given to the cities and exported, per capita rural retention rates are much, much higher than what is needed for heavy labor and what is needed for avoiding mortality. And this is true if we do this exercise separately for Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Basically, there is no aggregate shortage, no matter how you define it. There had to have been inequality in food distribution across the rural population within each republic for there to have been famine. Okay, I want to say a few other things before moving on. there are other factors, right? That one that comes up a lot in the literature. One is grain exports. People say, well, the Soviet Union was exporting a lot of grain. This contributed to famine mortality. So that might be true, but this is taken into account in retention. So this is taken out in procurement. So without taking away state culpability in still continuing to export so much grain, exports by itself cannot explain why the famine occurred. Another thing that comes up a lot is seed stocks. Seed stocks are around 11 to 15% of total production. And a lot of, and we know that peasants were consuming seed stocks. But the consumption of seed stocks, there's two ways to think about this. One is that even if all this was consumed, it's not enough to create an aggregate shortage. And I think the more relevant way to think about it, the correct way to think about it, is the consumption of seed stocks is the outcome of the famine. So when a famine happens, people will consume seed stocks. That's just part of the effect, right? And before you consume the seed stock, you have to have an aggregate shortage in production. And so if there's no aggregate shortage in production, the consumption of seed stocks by itself cannot explain the famine. And finally, is this issue of food waste, in the sense that what I gave you, those numbers are production numbers, production estimates, and procurement estimates that are taken away from audits. Like these are government counts of what was produced. But not everything that's produced will actually be consumed along the way of food being transported, food being stored. There might be waste. Some food might rot. Some of the production might be stored poorly. It might rot along during transportation. We don't really, so that what's available to the people is less than what those production estimates suggest. We don't have good data on waste. The best estimates we have from the Soviet era says it's around 5%. So this might have contributed to the available amount of food, but it cannot explain the famine, given that huge difference between food availability and what was needed for survival. Okay, so what do I take away from all this? What I take away from this is that the famine was caused by inequitable distribution, and there had to have been an equitable distribution within the rural population. So in the next part of the talk, the next part of the paper, we want to look and try to understand the patterns of distribution in the data. Specifically, we want to invest this claim, this very controversial claim that Ukrainians died more, all else equal. And we want to try to understand why. Why did they die more with the data to the extent that we can? Okay. Any questions about food accounting?
There is a question from Laszlo Halpern who says that 5% waste is not too high, but Andrei just responded to that. So, okay. And there is a general question from Olufemi Borgia. How come communists collectivized the agriculture with the intention to increase productivity, and suddenly productivity did not increase, and production actually started to decline? So I guess it's a bigger question. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the motivations of collectivization and the trajectory of production during the early Soviet era is extremely important, extremely interesting. It is a bigger question. I think all of the co-authors, and probably Sergey, have thought about it, and we're happy to talk about it, but I'm going to postpone that until after the presentation because it's a bit beyond the scope of our paper. I mean, we're happy to talk and speculate, but it's beyond what our data can speak to. Okay.
Yeah, there is a question from Ethan to compare Chinese and Soviet famines, but I guess it's a very big question that it will be easier to address afterwards.
Yes, exactly. So I would be delighted to address it, but it's also a little bit beyond the scope of this paper. So let's talk about this afterwards. It's a great question, and it's a very important question, and it's something close to my heart and that I've been thinking about a lot. Okay, data. Now, the subnational data, I'm not going to read all of this because it's a lot of words, and you guys can read more. You can read faster than I can speak. The important thing is our three republics cover most of the Soviet population and most of the grain producing regions. And most of the famine mortality, again, the notable exception is we don't have Kazakhstan. The Soviet Union did not collect data from Kazakhstan until after the famine. At the province level, we can construct a long and rich panel. So that is going to be our main analysis. At the district level, we can construct a short panel with fewer political variables. And so we're going to use that to supplement the province level. The nice thing about the district level is that we can see if the same patterns that exist across provinces also exist within provinces, as you would expect in a top-down system for systematic policies. Okay, another important thing to note is that there's no ethnic specific mortality data. So I'm going to be showing you the relationship between mortality in a given region and the ethnic Ukrainian population share. That is how we are going to infer ethnic specific mortality rates. And one last thing to point out is not all Ukrainians lived in the Ukraine. Most of them did, but around 5 million lived outside of Ukraine. And that's important because we're going to have variation. Our results are going to be true within the Ukraine and across the Soviet Union, and also if we drop and also if we omit Ukraine. Okay, so let me just show you a map of our data really quickly. This is at the province level, and you see where the mortality is. There's a lot of variation across regions. The darker it is, the higher the mortality rates. And then if you look at Ukrainian population share, of course, the highest concentration are in the Ukraine. And here I'm defining Ukrainians by the share of those who are ethnic Ukrainians in the 1926 census. So the highest concentration is in the Ukraine, but there's actually quite a bit of variation throughout the Soviet Union. And this is, and as I do this, I'm also showing you the boundaries of the district level data, which we'll look at later. Now I want to look at mortality over time quickly. And first, let's look at mortality. This is in figure A. On the y-axis, I'm going to plot death per 1,000. And this is in the red line. And on the x-axis, it's just years, right? And you see that mortality is pretty flat. And then, let me mention, this is detrended. I've taken out a time trend so that it's easier to see. You see that mortality spikes up in 1933. That is the peak of the famine. And then it goes down back to trend. Now, on the second y-axis with the blue dashed line, I am plotting the variance, the standard deviation across provinces normalized by mean mortality rates. And what you're seeing here is that the variance in mortality rates, I mean, there's always variation in mortality rates, right? There's always more mortality in some places than others, but it is pretty stable over time with the exception of the famine. In the year when there's famine, mortality becomes much more unequal, so that some provinces are taking the burden, are suffering a lot of mortality, and other provinces very little. So this is evidence that there is a lot of inequality in the spatial distribution of mortality across the population, right? And it's consistent with the fact, I mean, this has to be true, given that there's no aggregate deficit in food. There has to be inequality across the population. Now, you might be concerned, I mean, to the best of our knowledge, the mortality data are accurate. There's no mention by economic historians or people who study these data about misreporting. But nevertheless, even if there's no intentional misreporting, you might worry, what is state capacity for collecting mortality data in the face of a massive famine? One way to address that is to look at natality data. This is live birth per 1,000. Again, we see this is the mean across provinces. We see it's pretty flat over time, and then it starts to drop for the 1930 cohort, 1929 cohort. So if you're born in 1929, you're around 3-4 years old during the peak of the famine. So this deviation from trend are the babies that were never born or who were born and then died. And then it bottoms out for 1933 during the famine. So these are children that were born and died when the famine hit. This part during the famine are children that were born and died early or never born. And the same thing, what you see here is that when we look at the cross-province variance, it also spikes up during the famine. Right? Oh, sorry, I misspoke. This is live birth per 1,000. So these all just reflect children who weren't born. Or children who weren't born. And it could either be that the parents didn't get pregnant because there was a famine, or they got pregnant and they miscarried. All right. Let me move forward a little bit. So seeing that there is a lot of variation across space during the years when there was a famine in terms of mortality, let's try to understand the drivers of mortality across regions. Because the most closely connected thing to further the famine, you have to not eat enough. The first thing we look at is a relationship to food productivity. And we look at two measures of food productivity, reported grain and predicted grain. What we're doing here is we're regressing mortality next year on how much grain you produce this year, interacted with a famine dummy variable, controlling for urban population share interacted with a famine dummy variable, and also controlling for province and year fixed effects. And we always use Conley standard errors to adjust for spatial correlation. Okay, and what we see here is when we look at reported grain during non-famine years, it's uncorrelated with mortality rate the following year. And we look at the following year because grain produced this year feeds the population next year. But during the famine year, if we sum these two coefficients up, it's positive. During the famine year, the more they produced, the more likely they were to die. So grain production is positively associated with mortality rates. So this looks very similar to the Chinese famine, actually. The interesting thing here is that when you predict grain, right? And why are we predicting grain? Although there are no mentions in the literature about inaccuracies in regional grain production data. All of the discussion is about the inflation of aggregate grain production data. We just wanted to go the extra mile and be careful. So instead of using reported grain, what we do is we use data on weather and natural conditions in non-famine years and reported production in non-famine years, and we estimate a production function. And then we use that production function and weather and natural conditions during the famine year to predict grain production. When we predict it, when we use this predicted measure, the coefficients are similar, but unsurprisingly, given that predictions have noise, our estimates are no longer significant. But all of this becomes interestingly irrelevant once we control for Ukrainian population share. Once we control for Ukrainian population share, the coefficient for grain production goes down by a lot, regardless of whether you use a reported measure or the predicted measure. And going forward, just to be careful, we use the predicted measure, but it doesn't really change our main estimate about Ukrainians. Okay, so let me talk about Ukrainian population share. What does this coefficient say? This coefficient says that during the famine, provinces with more Ukrainians, a higher ethnic Ukrainian population share, suffered higher mortality. Right? And this is true even if we add controls for the pre-famine level of collectivization, the pre-famine level of dekulakization, and the pre-famine level of livestock drop. And why are we doing this? Because you might be concerned that losing a lot of kulaks who may have just been entrepreneurial farmers, losing livestock from collectivization, this might have further reduced the ability of regions to produce food or even to consume food. And if these things happen more in Ukrainian populated areas, then it will confound our interpretation of this coefficient. So that's why we're controlling for these things. So we're going to, the way you should think about the conceptual exercise going forward is that we're going to try to control for everything that happens before the famine and see if this coefficient survives. And it does. And the last one, what am I going to do is I'm going to omit province fixed effects, because you might think that a lot of the variation in Ukrainian population share doesn't change. It doesn't change that much over time, right? Ukrainian population share across regions. So if we control for province fixed effects, we might be over controlling. It turns out to not really matter because the effect of Ukrainian population share only matters during the famine. Okay, and if you're curious about how to interpret the magnitude, we present the standardized coefficients. So this tells you, let's go back to the baseline, that tells you that during the famine, in a region that had one standard deviation more ethnic Ukrainians, they suffered 0.825 standard deviation more in terms of mortality per capita. So this is a huge effect. Okay, you know, there's a lot of measurement issues that you can raise. So we're going to address this in one by one. The first one is there are different ways of measuring ethnicity. Our baseline measure is to use self-reported ethnicity in the 1926 famine. Alternatively, in rural areas. So it's a rural Ukrainian population share. That's our baseline measure. Alternatively, you can say, well, what about all Ukrainians, including urban, the urban population, or what if we only use the urban population? So the results are very similar qualitatively and even in magnitude if you focus on the standardized estimates. The reason that this coefficient is so big is because there are many, many fewer urban Ukrainians, so the level estimates will be larger. Another way of proxying for Ukrainian population share is to see in the 1926 census how many people report Ukrainian as their mother tongue. Similarly, we can go back further in time and use the 1897 census, right? So again, if you focus on the standardized coefficients, these are all pretty similar. Finally, you know, we want to know, is this a Ukraine phenomenon, like Ukraine versus the rest of the Soviet Union, or is this about ethnic Ukrainians everywhere in the Soviet Union? So what do? We omit the Ukraine. So in this sample, you see we have a smaller sample size. We have omitted the Ukraine, and we are running the same regression on the rest of the Soviet Union, and we have a very similar result. So this is really about ethnic Ukrainians, not about the administrative division between the Ukraine and the rest of and the other republics. The next thing I want to do is
just wanted to mention that you have 15 minutes left about. Okay.
Okay, great. The next thing I want to do is to look at the timing, right? Is higher Ukrainian mortality specific to the famine, or are we getting a spurious correlation that's happening like, you know, here and there? So instead of having a famine dummy, I'm going to estimate that same regression, except now I will interact the Ukrainian population share with the dummy variable for every single year. And here what we see is that there's no correlation between Ukrainian population share and mortality for any year except the famine year. This is really a famine phenomenon. And this is also really interesting. These are the year dummy estimates and that regression. This tells you the mortality rates for the other ethnicities over time, and you don't see anything. It's really just about the Ukrainians. Again, remember, we don't have Kazakhstan, right? So in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, it's really just about Ukrainians as far as the mortality data goes. Now, let me be very clear. This does not mean that other ethnic groups did not die from the famine. It just means that we have very precise estimates for the Ukraine. Okay. And to make that point more salient, that everyone suffered, but that Ukrainians suffered more, let's look at the fertility data. So these are live birth per 1,000. These are live birth per 1,000. And what do we see? We see, this is the interaction effect. We see that over time, we see this pattern that fertility is going down during the famine more in places with more Ukrainians. fertility is going down during the famine for all ethnicities, right? These are the Euro-specific facts. And in addition, they're going down even more for Ukrainians. And this is interesting to note and important to note. What it means is that mortality is an extreme outcome. Before people die, people will have stop having babies or stop having live births. So there are things that we can pick up these more nuanced shocks with the fertility data that we may not get as precisely with the mortality data. All right. In the next slide, what we're going to do is you might say, well, maybe there are geographic and demographic differences between the Ukraine, where the Ukrainians lived and where other people lived. So we're just going to control for these things. We're going to control for the demographic structure. This is gender and age concentration, age composition. We're going to control for the latitude and longitude, each interacted with each other and the famine demi. We're going to weigh the estimates by population. So we don't treat, right now, our baseline treats each province as an observation, but we can also population weight it. We can omit outliers. We can omit the Ukraine again. Oh, this is repetitive. We should get rid of this. We can also omit the Ukraine and the lower Volga region and the North Caucasus region and Western Siberia. And our results will survive qualitatively. Obviously, when we start to omit all of these grain producing regions, the estimates become smaller, but qualitatively, the effect of Ukrainians and mortality survives. Finally, we want to do an interesting exercise for the 1892 famine. So you might think that, oh, well, Ukrainians, they might have different social capital, different social organization. Maybe they are genetically more vulnerable to famine. So let's look at another famine. So the last large SARS famine was 1892. And when we look at the effect, the relationship between Ukrainians and famine mortality in that famine, we find absolutely nothing. So this connection between Ukrainians and famine is a Soviet famine, it's a Soviet phenomenon. In panel B, I do the same thing with natality. We get the same result. The signs are opposite, right? But we get the same results. Okay, so now let's move on to the last part of the talk in my last 10 minutes or so. Why did okay, so what I've shown you is that the Ukrainians died more, right? Everyone suffered, yes, that's true. But the Ukrainians died even more. So what are the different possible explanations? One possible explanation is that this was a despite best intentions story, that some places produce a lot where the Ukrainians they weren't able to produce very much. And it was at a very disaggregate level that we're not picking up with our accounting exercise. And the government was unable to transport food from surplus regions to the regions where the Ukrainians live, where they didn't produce any food. This cannot be the explanation, because if that was true, the mortality should be negatively associated with production. Any despite best intentions story has to produce a correlation, has to produce a pattern where more people die in places that produce less food. We don't see that in this data set. Okay, another possibility is that there's bad luck, right? Ukrainians happen to be concentrated in areas that were productive, that was targeted by early Soviet economic policies that just didn't go very well. Or those areas experienced bad weather, which resulted in bad harvests. Okay, so the evidence I've shown you already suggests that that's not very likely, because we find that this pattern is robust to controlling for weather-driven or reported agricultural productivity, along with a bunch of other pre-famine agricultural policies like collectivization, decolocalization, and livestock drop. In addition, we can control for more political factors. I'll show you that the results stay robust. Okay, the third possibility is that higher Ukrainian mortality was due to an ethnically biased policy that targeted Ukrainians. We're going to investigate this with the data. We're going to try and see whether the Ukrainians resisted collectivization more than other ethnic groups, and then whether Soviet policies or loyalty to the regime resulted in higher famine mortality for ethnic Ukrainians relative to other groups. So first, let me show you the patterns of resistance. So our data from resistance come from declassified secret police reports on terror attacks, mass demonstrations, and leaflets. For brevity, we're going to combine all of these using a principal component. In the paper, we show it to you measure by measure. So when I look at resistance as an outcome variable, let's just look at column 3 for brevity. What I find, this is a cross-section of 19 provinces. What I find is that in places that were collectivized, but a collectivization is a share of households in the province that are living in a collective farm. So in places with no Ukrainians, more collectivization results in more resistance. It's positive and significant. The interaction shows that the relationship between collectivization and resistance doubles in a place that's 100% Ukrainians. So Ukrainians did resist more. Now, let me show you what happens to that relationship between Ukrainian population share and famine mortality when I control for basically every political variable that we can come up with. So first, we look at grain production in 1928. This was a measure used for the first 5-year plan in terms of targeting agricultural policies. The share of people that voted for the Bolsheviks in the free election of 1917. This is a proxy of loyalty to the regime. The number of rural communists, these are the people, these are the bureaucrats who were procuring grain. The number of delegates they were able to send to the 1930 vote that voted pro-collectivization, another measure of loyalty to the regime or zealousness or commitment to collectivization. The number of those resistance, the number of terrorist acts, mass demonstrations, leaflets, or just the principal component of these different measures of resistance. For every single case, when I add a control of this variables of political factors or loyalty to the regime interacted with famine, the Ukrainian coefficient is robust, right? And in addition, we just control for it. We add a ton of other controls that proxy for pre-famine culture and revolt, history of violence and civil action, pre-famine land owning institution, income and wealth inequality, productivity, economic growth. Our results are always very, very robust. So it does not seem like the higher Ukrainian mortality is a coincidence with anything that we can see in the data. The last part, did Soviet policies increase famine mortality more for Ukrainians? What do we do here? I take those same political variables and to estimate the triple interaction of that variable, Ukrainian population share, and of famine dummy. And what you see here, let's look at columns 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. In each case, the triple interaction is positive. So what does that mean? It means that these measures of loyalty to the central regime increase mortality more for Ukrainians, right? These measures of resistance increase famine, so pre-famine resistance to collectivization increases famine mortality more for Ukrainians. And then this one is really interesting, column 4. I've saved the best for last. This divides for the delegates that are being sent to that 1930 Party Congress. We actually know who they are. So we actually know whether that delegate himself is ethnically Ukrainian or not. So we can look at the influence of the ethnicity of that delegate. And what we find is that for the both types of delegates, the more delegates there are, the more Ukrainians died during the famine. But the effect is larger when the delegate is not ethnically Ukrainian himself. And this is consistent with stories of Ukrainian bureaucrats and party members resigning as the famine got worse in Ukraine. They relented earlier, so to speak. Okay, so we can look at the timing of the effect of each of these factors and how they increase Ukrainian mortality during the famine. In one regression, we will come up with temporal patterns very similar to the Ukrainian effect in the sense that it's really just about the famine year. It's a very sharp timing. So this is really a famine phenomenon. The very last thing I'm going to show you is the same set of triple difference regressions, except now the outcome is the policy, the most important agricultural policy that is believed to have led to the famine, which are the collectivization policies. So the dependent variable here is the share of households that are collectivized. And what you see is that those proxies for political loyalty to the regime or the degree of resistance before the famine that led to higher Ukrainian mortality during the famine, they also led to higher Ukrainian collectivization during the famine. Similarly, we can further break down collectivization into the upside and the downside. The upside was mechanization, right? In fact, the Ukrainian Communist Party explicitly thought that the deal they would do with the Soviet is that they would provide grain while the Soviets gave them mechanization. We can measure mechanization in terms of tractors' horsepower, and what we find is that they didn't actually get that. So the same things that caused higher Ukrainian mortality and higher collectivization resulted in Ukrainians getting less mechanization. When we look at procurement rate, this is the amount of food that's procured as a share of production or as a share of the world population, we find the opposite. Those same factors that led to higher Ukrainian mortality and higher collectivization for Ukrainians led to higher procurement from Ukrainians. Okay, I lied earlier. The very last thing I'll show you is that the same relationship that exists across provinces also exists across districts within provinces using our district level estimate. And a very interesting thing is, if you read recent books about the Ukrainian, about the famine by people like Applebaum or others, one thing they keep talking about are these anecdotal evidence from letters people write saying, oh, you know, when I crossed the border from the Ukraine into Russia, I went from a land of no famine, of famine to no famine. So we wanted to look at that to see if there was this distinct border effect. And so what we do is this is just excess mortality rate using the district level data as we get closer and closer to the Ukraine and Russia border. And then as we get further and further away, both from the Ukrainian side and from the Russian side. When you look at the data that's only normalized by urban share, you indeed find a discrete drop in famine mortality when you cross the border from Ukraine to Russia. However, if you demean by Ukrainian ethnic share, that relationship totally disappears. And again, this is telling you that this is not about the relevant division is not the administrative one between the Ukraine and Russia or other republics. The relevant division is about ethnicity between ethnic Ukrainians and other ethnicities. If we take our results literally, and we do a back of the envelope calculation, we find that if ethnic Ukrainians are at the same level as other ethnic groups, which are mostly Russians in our sample, then we're going to get 76% lower mortality in the full sample and 92% in the Ukraine. So let me conclude because I'm out of time. When we started this project, right, I guess we were thinking there were two possible causes of the famine. One is bad luck, aggregate shortage, or unintended consequences, like the Chinese famine to some extent. The other possibility were these very highly controversial claims that this was an outcome of Soviet policy to control Ukrainians. So after spending many, many years collecting data and more data and collecting more data and more data and looking at the data, what we find is that there's really no evidence for the first category explanation. We find no aggregate food shortage in the Soviet Union or the Ukraine. And we find that excess Ukrainian mortality is robust to anything that we throw at it. And we've thrown a lot at it. In contrast, we find a lot of evidence for the second and very controversial claim, which is that we see in the data that Ukrainians did resist collectivization more than other ethnic groups. And we see in the data that Soviet policy and loyalty to the regime was resulting in more aggressive food procurement and mortality from ethnic Ukrainians, right? So that's sort of what we get from all this work. And I think I don't have time to talk about it. I think there's a lot of interesting questions for future research. One is, what were the political economic consequences of this famine? For the Great Purge, for World War II, for the post-91 era, for right now, for today. Another obviously important topic that needs to be looked into is what happened in Kazakhstan. And on that note, I'm going to end. Thank you so much. And your comments and suggestions are incredibly welcome.
Thank you very much, Nancy, and thank you for almost observing the time. I think it was great, and there will have been lots of questions on chat. I suggest that we move to voice questions, and so please raise your hand if you want to ask a question. In the meanwhile, I would like to ask Ethan Kaplan to ask a couple of questions he raised on chat and didn't get an answer. One is comparison China and Russia, and the other one on age gender decomposition and age gender gradient and potentially outcomes post World War II, post 54. So Ethan, would you like to ask this question? Can you unmute yourself?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, Nancy.
Hi.
Fascinating paper. I'm really glad I got to see it. I think my big question is that, so for instance, I know that in China, or maybe you know better than I do, but what I used to know about China was that there was a lot of, there were production targets that were set and they were increased very rapidly. And local Communist Party cadre were afraid to actually report the actual production levels, which didn't meet the very ambitious goals during the Great Leap Forward. And so what happened is that they would send the procurement targets to the central administration, and then the local population would starve. And what I was wondering is, how confident are you in the quality of the data if the data is being generated under strong political incentives? And then I also had one potential suggestion, which is that, could you look to see whether or not, and you could do this just before World War II and then maybe after 1954, the mortality patterns across districts that vary with the Ukrainian share, and also the age and gender gradients of the mortality patterns. If you can see them in later years where there might not be a strong political incentives and data reporting.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So let me answer I'll answer the last one first. So our mortality data right now we have for 2 years, like 1 or 3 years. So we can look into it. I think Natasha and Andrei will know better, like what other district level mortality data we might be able to find with a lot more effort. But going to the more important conceptual question of how do we think of potential measurement error from bias reporting in the production data. So to the best of our knowledge, the regional production data has not been biased. No one's talked about it. And there's a big difference between China, and one big difference for why this might be was that the regional production data was only used internally. It was never really meant to be public. And the Soviet government seemed to have had a much better lid on the situation than the Chinese communists. So that was much more public. It was in newspapers. People were talking about it, like Henan province, Anhui province, produced so much, were like amazing. So that whole political process with regional production didn't play out in the Soviet Union the way it played out in China. But in addition, that you still might worry. And what I would say is that's addressed in the regression, because the way those targets are set are based on fundamentals of production capacity. The way that those targets were ratcheted up, like in China, they were ratcheting up more for the places that were more productive. So when we use these weather and natural condition fundamentals to predict for grain and control for the interaction of that in famine, we're actually controlling for that in some very reduced form way.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks. If you want to ask another question, please raise your hand or say that in chat. Arkan, Orkan, good to see you. Yeah.
Hi, Sergey. Thanks. Maybe this is just about semantics, and I actually raised this question in the chat. I was wondering, especially with the three-way interactions, how should we interpret them? Is it that so you're seeing a lot of evidence of Ukrainians being targeted, but at the same time you're showing that there are certain characteristics that are kind of driving that. So is the takeaway that the Soviet regime targeted certain characteristics, and these characteristics happen to be more concentrated in the Ukrainian side? If that's the case, why are we caring so much about the Ukrainian results per se?
Yeah, no, so that's a great question. So the way you should interpret those triple interactions is that those triple interactions, like let's say share a Bolshevik, I'll just give an example, like share a Bolshevik vote in the 1917. That's a proxy for loyalty or commitment, whatever you want to call it, to the Bolshevik regime, to the central regime. And what the triple interaction shows you is that the loyalty to the central regime causes more famine mortality in places with more Ukrainians. It is not saying that the loyalty, people are more loyal in places with more Ukrainians, right? In fact, the earlier regression, we have the double difference. We actually control for Bolshevik 1917, and we show you even for two places with the same degree of commitment to the Bolsheviks, Ukrainians suffer higher mortality during the famine.
I guess maybe I can just follow up with one more question. If you were to do this without any, without conditioning the regression on the Ukrainians, would you find similar results with those?
No, we wouldn't. Oh, here's the interesting thing. So just to be parsimonious, because there's a lot of numbers, but I'm glad you asked. We don't present it because it's not the focus of our paper, but the double interaction of Bolshevik share in 1917 interacted with the famine dummy in that triple difference interaction, it's actually 0. So what that means is that having higher commitment to the Soviet regime does not increase famine mortality in places without Ukrainians. It only increases mortality in places with Ukrainians. And the more Ukrainians there are, the more it increases mortality.
Okay, great, thanks.
And in the chat, people asked about other ethnicities, and I think Andrei said that you can find some other ethnicities with a significant coefficients. Is there something you remember? No, I misinterpreted your answer.
Yeah, so we looked at every ethnicity, and what we find is that the results for the other ethnicities, they move around a lot as we introduce controls. So some are significant, some aren't. But and what's significant? So the coefficients and the precision varies as we introduce controls. In our sample, it is only Ukrainians interacted with famine that is consistently positive and statistically significant.
Excellent. We are running out of time, and I don't see other questions to be asked except for a question from David Freeman, who is asking whether the slides will be available. So
sure.
Sure. So we will put the slides alongside with the paper and the video on CEPR website. So I think that is it for now. Thank you very much for joining the seminar. I think it was a lively discussion, most of it on chat and some afterwards. Thanks, Nancy, for sticking to the time and answering the questions. And next time we'll see each other in a month, and Paula Giuliano will present, and a month after Francesca Trebbi will present. Thank you all, and thank you most of all, Nancy, Natalya and Andrei, and thanks CEPR and Gabriel in particular. Thank you.